Alone show. Very excited today to have James Carden returning. His Substack is the Realist Review. You guys should check that out. He publishes not just his own stuff, but from really, really great Russia experts as well. So, James, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
All right. Yep. Great to have you back on, James. Now, got a few things I want to talk to you about today. A lot happening around the world. Can the New START treaty be saved? Can Trump end the war in Ukraine? And the WNDs of Latin America may have a little fun with this last one. So, starting off here, there's been some conversations around nuclear tests. Trump has even talked about testing a nuclear weapon in the past 24 hours. But I have these clips of Trump and Putin discussing the recent test of nuclear weapons in the American response.
But the Poseidon significantly surpasses the Sarmat in terms of power, and moreover, in terms of speed and operating depth, there is nothing like this unmanned device anywhere else in the world. It's unlikely that anything comparable will appear in the near future, and there are no means of interception.
Just one more on the nuclear announcement. Do you worry that we're entering a more risky environment when it comes to nuclear issues?
No, I don't think so. I think we have it pretty well locked up. But we have more than anybody. But I see them testing. I say, well, if they're going to test, I guess we have to test.
So, James, what do you make of Trump talking about testing nuclear weapons?
I'm not terribly surprised, given the people that he has around him, who are all pretty much, with regard to the tit for tat nuclear threats, we're getting into almost a parody of a parody. I'm reminded when I see Putin there, I'm reminded of, the villain from Austin Powers. This is really a sad commentary of how far we've come from the age of Reagan and Gorbachev, where the two of them pledged never to fight a nuclear war because one can never be won. So we're really back to the depths of the Cold War. And I find it disturbing that so many people in the Washington establishment look back on the Cold War as what they call an era of bipolarity, and they say, how stable it was and how wonderful it was. Well, the fact of the matter is that we barely got out of the Cold War alive. And I would urge people to see the new movie by Catherine Bigelow on Netflix, The House of Dynamite, because I hope that it serves as a wake-up call to people that these increasing tit-for-tat nuclear threats are grave danger, not only to U.S.-Russia relations, but to humanity. This isn't really a joking matter, and Trump is really letting down the side of, realists and restrainers by engaging in this kind of rhetoric. But that's not the only area in which he's seemingly let down the side. I suspect we'll get to that.
Yeah, well, talking about the Cold War there and the U.S.-Russian relationship then, I was born as the Cold War was over. And so, I wasn't supposed to grow up in an era of nuclear brinksmanship between the U.S. and Russia. I always remember, my first understanding of geopolitics between the U.S. and Russia is in the movie Terminator 2, when John Connor's, the little kid about my age, and he asked Arnold, the Terminator, I thought Russia was our friends now. And, Arnold explains that Skynet doesn't care, but it's because the premise of the whole series no longer made sense if there wasn't nuclear brinksmanship between the U.S. and Russia. So, James, I know there's a lot of history here that we could certainly go over, but maybe a couple road marks how we got from the end of the Cold War, supposed warming relations between the U.S. and Russia, to now a security environment, which a lot of people say is worse than what we had during the Cold War.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit ahead of you. I'm a child of the sort of close to the end of the Cold War. I came along in the last months of the Gerald Ford administration. Um, you know, it strikes me as very disturbing that I remember being in college in the um, mid to late 1990s and reading a column by George Will. And Will posited that our children um, may not live in interesting times. Well, Will, as he so often is, was dead wrong. This was only a few years before 9/11. How did we get into this position where U.S. Russian relations are now more dangerous than they were during the height of the Cold War? Well, the answer has in part to do with 1992. 1992, I see as kind of a hinge of history. If things had gone differently in the election of 1992 between Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, I don't think that we'd be in this position right now. Ambassador Jack Matlock, who was Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the Soviet Union between 1987 and 1999, has said that he doesn't think that Bush would have pursued the project of NATO expansion had Bush won. It was really the onset of the Clinton presidency where the United States took upon itself this idea, this self assigned mission to recreate, to try to transform post Soviet Russia in its own image. And that project went terribly awry. And we ignored, Clinton ignored, people like his top Russian advisors, Stroh Talbot, ignored his top national security team, people like Warren Christopher and Anthony Lake and Sandy Berger, and of course Madeleine Albright, all ignored the protests coming from the Russian government at the time, telling them, please do not expand NATO. But we did it anyway, because there was this idea in the 90s that democracy was going to overcome every other political system. And so it was inevitable. So it was this sort of teleological idea that democracy and free markets are the endpoint, the natural endpoint of all political systems. Of course, that sounds ridiculous today, but people really believed it. And no group of people believed it more than the Clinton administration. So it begins then, and it just goes downhill from there. But if I were to place really a turning point in relations between the United States and Russia, it doesn't start with Vladimir Putin's entry onto the scene in '99. It starts well before then.
Absolutely, fantastic analysis. Now, to kind of go from there, one of the things that has happened, during George W. Bush and subsequent administrations is the destruction of the Soviet era arms control agreements between the United States and Russia. Right, like these were really important: the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Anti Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty for monitoring this agreement. And the last one, and it's even been eroded. It's not like it's in full force, but the New START Treaty. This is set to expire, I believe, in February, or right around the beginning of the month. James, what are the chances that the Trump administration is prepared to engage in serious negotiations to extend this thing?
I've seen no evidence that they are, but again, we don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. I know that Vladimir Putin has publicly expressed his desire to extend it. That's something that they should have hammered out and agreed to immediately when they met in Alaska. You're absolutely right. One of the key problems that we face is this legacy of tearing up these agreements that were painstakingly put together during the course of the Cold War. The principal architect of this policy of tearing up these agreements is someone whose name has been in the news recently, John Bolton. Before John Bolton became Donald Trump's national security advisor in his first term, he worked in the George W. Bush administration, and it was his idea to tear up the ABM. And then when Bolton came back under Trump, they tore up the INF. So this has been a long-term neoconservative project. And I would say, and I'm very critical of the Democrats, and I'm critical of the Democrats a lot of the time because I'm disappointed. But even the Democrats, even the most hawkish Democrats, would never go for something like that. But it's been these neocons like Bolton who've been pushing that thing, who've been pushing this sort of policy to just tear up the infrastructure of arms control. And it's terrible. And that's not the only; those aren't the only agreements that they've torn up. They tore up open skies also. So we are in much, much less safe than we were than when Trump came to office in 2017. And it's largely because of these characters like Bolton.
Absolutely. And this is an interesting thing that sometimes I get hung up on with people when I'm trying to discuss this with them, because you talk about Trump's first administration when it comes to Russia policy. And even if people still don't believe the whole Russiagate narrative, they still have an idea in their head that Trump was somehow pro Russia, or at least not adversarial towards Russia, right? They believe he liked Vladimir Putin, and kind of,
No,
the two got along. And this meant something positive for the US Russian relationship. During Trump's first administration, though, we look at sanctions, the destruction of these arms control agreements. How much do you think Trump really did damage to the US Russia relationship during his first administration?
well, I think a tremendous amount. I think that it's largely in the Democrats, particularly these fools who appear on MSNBC and CNN, make such a big deal about Trump's alleged affinity for Putin or whatever. And I'm sure there's something to that. I'm sure that when Trump looks at Putin's quite extravagant wealth and lifestyle, he's quite impressed. He's impressed by that sort of thing. Nevertheless, it never translated into better relations or better policy. Trump, remember, overturned Obama's prohibition against sending Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine.
Mhm.
Trump has repeatedly taken a harder line on Russia than even Obama did. So that gets lost. These commentators mistake the form for the substance when it comes to Trump and Russia. What Trump is finding out now is that Putin is indeed going to string him along until he gets what he wants. Because there's no getting away from the fact that the Russians are winning the war in Ukraine on the ground. And there's very little that the Ukrainians or the Europeans or the United States is going to be able to do to change that.
So, I want to take this conversation to the war in Ukraine now. So perfect. Um, the first question, though, is more just about the U.S. Russian relationship in general. Do you think we need to see an end to the war in Ukraine before that could start to improve, or could the U.S. and Russia kind of improve some bilateral ties, maybe reduce some sanctions, look at arms control with the war in Ukraine ongoing?
Not only can it happen, it should happen. The United States cannot see U.S. Russian relations solely through the prism of the war in Ukraine. That's a terrible mistake. We have plenty of business, unfinished business, important business to conduct with the Russians. Whether the Russians or don't like the Russians, whether you think Vladimir Putin is a terrible murdering tyrant or not, it doesn't matter. We have work to do with them, particularly as we were discussing earlier with regard to arms control in terms of nuclear weapons. That's extremely important. We cannot link what happens in Ukraine to the rest of the U.S. Russian relationship. And that's, that this is another lesson from the Cold War, if I might, um, you know, um, digress for a second. Under the Carter administration, Carter's national security advisor was Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he was a diplomat. He was born in Poland during the interwar years, and he was very hardline, anti-Russia, anti-Soviet, for understandable reasons. However, it was Brzezinski's insistence that Carter linked Soviet actions on human rights and other areas to everything else. Well, that didn't work. When Reagan came in, he brought in a more sensible Secretary of State named George Shultz. And George Shultz thought that linkage was a stupid idea. And so Schultz said, we're going to de-link. We're going to work with the Russians, with the Soviets, on areas where we can work with them. And then, if there are areas of disagreement, we'll discuss those. But we're not going to link everything. So, Reagan and Schultz had a tremendously successful policy towards the Soviet Union. I don't think anyone would argue that. Far more successful than Carter Brzezinski, right? So linkage is a stupid idea. Been tried, it's been disproven. We shouldn't do it.
I mean, fantastic point. I do worry that, unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that Trump is just going to get hung up on the war in Ukraine. And I'm wondering your thoughts on Andy. I have this clip of Sergei, meeting for talks ending the war in Ukraine earlier this week.
We also need guarantees that the meeting between the presidents will yield concrete results. We are ready for this result. Moreover, in Anchorage, when Presidents Putin and Trump met in Alaska, we supported the proposals that, a week before that, the U.S. President's special representative, Stephen Witkoff, brought to Moscow. In Alaska, through President Putin, we double-checked with Mr. Witkoff, who was present there, to make sure we understood his proposal correctly. In the presence of his own president, he confirmed that our understanding was correct, and we said that we were ready to move forward on this basis already, toward formalizing the final agreements. And by and large, we are still currently waiting for the United States to officially confirm the proposals that they gave us, proposals which we have taken as the basis for our ongoing discussions.
So, James, what do you think? Any prospects here that there's going to be some serious diplomacy going on anytime soon regarding Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. I don't view that. I don't think that the war is even close to ending. I think that unless there's a change in tone from Europe, and certainly a change in tone from Kyiv, that it's very, very unlikely. And I think that Putin's objective with regard to his dealings with Trump is to try to get something for nothing, right? So he's floated this idea a number of times that, well, I would like to end the war, but Ukraine is going to have to give up, parts of the Oblast that we've annexed but haven't conquered. Well, that's an impossible thing for the Ukrainians to agree to, particularly for Zelensky to agree to. Because if he agreed to that, I believe that he would be killed by his own people. So the Russians are going to either have to move their own goalposts, or they're going to have to conquer the land that they actually want. I don't think that it's sort of a reasonable request on the part of Putin and the Russians to say, all right, we'll end it, but you just have to give us this land that we actually haven't conquered. On the other side, the Ukrainians have unrealistic expectations as well. And Trump fed those unrealistic expectations when he said a couple of weeks ago, well, you know, they should try to win back all the land. They're not going to win back any of the land, and they should really stop asking about Crimea. So there needs to be a little bit more give and take between the two principal parties to the conflict. My suggestion, not that anyone's going to care, but for Trump would be to simply now disengage. And I think that maybe that's the way that the White House is headed.
Well, I guess we can only hope that that is the direction the White House is headed. There have, been some positive signs on all of this. Now, one of the things that I've kind of found striking is they're talking about, we're going to give Ukraine $2 billion in weapons over the next few months, probably till the end of the year. They're talking about providing with Ukraine between 12 and 15 billion in weapons next year. These are going to be American weapons bought by Europeans for Ukraine through the NATO Plural Fund. It doesn't seem that the math really adds up looking at how much this war has cost Ukraine during the first few years of the conflict. Zelensky is saying they need 60 billion in additional military support beyond what Kiev is putting in every year. And so, I mean, is this war going to have a military solution and just no chance at diplomacy going forward? And maybe the White House disengaging and pulling the plug is just going to speed up the process of the military defeat of Ukraine?
I suspect that we will approve more aid. I also suspect that it will have about as much difference as all the other aid packages that we've sent. So, from the perspective of the administration, they don't want to be seen as cutting off, this besieged and plucky Democratic ally of ours. So it doesn't really hurt from Washington's perspective to approve a yet another tranche of aid. The reality is that the war is lost, and it's really up to Zelensky or the people around Zelensky to save themselves and call it a day. Because the figures that we're receiving via the New York Times and the Washington Post with regard to casualty rates are not even remotely close to reality, right? So this is going to end one way or another. And I think that Trump's team probably sees that.
So,
But I would set that aside because, in my view, that's a done deal. And we have to get on, Washington has to get on with the hard work of reestablishing some semblance of a normal relationship with this country. Not because because Trump or we should be pro-Russian, not because of anything like that, but because it's simple common sense, given Russia's location, given its nuclear arsenal, given its importance in Europe and Asia, right? And so basically, what we need to do is to figure out a way to get back to some sort of normal, non hostile relationship with this country. If not,
yeah. So, James, I want to take the conversation south of the border. It's almost surprising to me that I have spent so much time talking about potential regime change war in our own hemisphere, but it seems the administration is really ramping up for it. They're saying Maduro is a narco terrorist, that Maduro is importing drugs into the U.S. that are killing people. There is no evidence. He's the head of our cartel. There's no evidence that Venezuela is a major hub of fentanyl trafficking into the United States. And yet we have Lindsey Graham, who he's easy to dismiss in some ways, but at the same time, he does seem to really reflect the position of a lot of the administration. And this is what he's saying about Venezuela.
President Trump has decided to treat drug cartels as national security threats. Remember the caliphate, the ISIS caliphate that President Trump destroyed? We have a drug caliphate in our backyard. Venezuela is run by an indicted drug dealer, Maduro, who's not a legitimate president of Venezuela. It's a safe haven for drug cartels. So President Trump has a policy that if you're in the drug business, you're a drug cartel and you're having boats come to America, we're going to blow up the boats. I think his policy is going to go on the land. If you're a country housing drug cartels, we're going to treat you as a national security threat to our country. There is a caliphate in our backyard. Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba are all countries that have allowed drug cartels to operate with impunity, make money off poisoning America, and these countries should be on notice. With Donald Trump, the game is changing.
So, James, I know this is Lindsey Graham. He's not the smartest man in Washington, D.C., but he does have a lot of political influence in thinking. I think he's very similar in his thinking to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. How concerned are you that we are going to end up with a real war somewhere in our own hemisphere?
I think it's happening. I do want to say something about, Lindsey Graham. I would be deeply ashamed if I was a resident of South Carolina to repeatedly put this nonentity in full back in the Senate over and over again. The second thing that I have to note is Graham's kind of shameless skill in terms of his calling it a caliphate. um, it's like he's trying, he's skillfully kind of, dog whistling the all of these words for the hardest line, neocons
Mm-hmm.
and warmongers in Washington. A drug caliphate. Okay. So it's horrible. I mean, basically, the administration has been on a murder spree in the Caribbean for the past, couple of months. They're not the first to do this, though. I'm not excusing it. However, your viewers may recall that the president of Hope and Change, Mr. Obama, came to office and immediately commenced with a kill list that was supervised by none other than John Brennan. So we've developed this kind of gruesome habit of blowing people out of the sky, out of the water. Sometimes they're not terrorists or drug runners. Sometimes they're just members of a wedding party. Sometimes, in the case of Mr. Obama, they happen to be American citizens. So, this is a now longstanding bad habit of the United States government, and I wish it would stop. And I certainly would wish that television networks stop putting this bloodthirsty fool Graham on their airwaves, but of course they won't.
So, do you see this as maybe stretching things quite a bit further than the terror war? I certainly don't endorse the interpretation of the 2001 authorization for use of military force that says anybody from Morocco to the Philippines who declares allegiance to Osama bin Laden could now be murdered by the U.S. government, which is effectively how they've used the 2001 AUMF since. However, there's no plausible way that skips over the Atlantic Ocean and now suddenly includes drug runners in the Caribbean. I know not Marco terrorism, Marco Rubio has put a lot of these cartels on the foreign terrorism organization list. But still, that I know Pete Hegseth is calling them Al Qaeda like, but still, this seems like a stretch beyond all recognition of U.S. law and constitution.
Of course it is. Of course it is. They're absolutely shameless. Marco terrorism. I mean, yeah. I mean, well, of course, that's what you get when you appoint people like Marco and Hegseth and Waltz, and now Marco, of course, is dual-hatted as the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. It's really disappointing. Disappointing. I thought that Trump might have learned his lesson from the first term. When you appoint neocons, you get bad policy, but it doesn't seem like he's learned that lesson. So it's too bad. It's still sort of early days, but I think the trend is set. I think we can see where it's going. So it's really too bad.
Yeah, I don't see many bright signs. Maybe I'll start being a little bit more optimistic if I see John Brennan behind bars. Of course, it won't be for his Mideast murder spree, but at least the Russiagate saga. He definitely deserves it. James, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your time and sharing all of your great insights with my audience. Other than the Realist Review, anywhere you want to tell people to go to check out your work?
No, that's about it. I sometimes make a guest appearance on the wonderful antiwar.com. So thank you very much, Kyle. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. We reprint quite a bit of your stuff and, most of the stuff that you guys have over at the Realist Review. So always happy to have a new one of your articles in my feed in the morning, James. We will have to do it again soon. Thank you.